So we're going to record the presentation. So when you're thinking about yourself and how confident you are, of course, this is showing some overconfidence. Maybe Ahana shouldn't be overconfident, but other people probably are somewhat overconfident about their driving. As we can see, we're probably it should be, when we're comparing ourselves to others on this call, we should be, half of us should be in the top half and half of us should be in the bottom half. But we see that over 3/4 of us are in the top half and under 1/4 of us are in the bottom half. And so this is a problem. And this is a pretty typical tendency for us. And this is the same that I get in other places, other Fortune 500 companies, tech companies, when I do this sort of polling. This is called the overconfidence bias. And somebody mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a special case of the overconfidence bias. So the overconfidence bias is our tendency to be way too confident. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a specific case of overconfidence bias. When we know a little bit about a topic, we tend to be way more confident about a topic. So here's how the Dunning-Kruger effect might play out in this case. There was a study done on college students, and they were asked, well, are you an above average driver or are you a below average driver? Same thing that I asked, top half or bottom half. And what the study found is that college students, 94% of them felt that they were above average drivers. So, and that, of course, they have much less experience driving than you do. And still, you have much worse breakdown. At least only 3/4 of you felt you were in the top half. 1/4 of you felt that you were in the bottom half. But with college students, 94% of them felt they were in the top half. So if you know a little bit about a topic, you tend to be more overconfident than if you know more about a topic. But the overconfidence bias in general is our tendency to be way too confident. There was another study that showed when people are 100% confident, they're right only 80% of the time on average. That's a problem. It's especially dangerous for those with more experience and more authority. And of course, you're all leaders here. So think about your own leadership and how you're thinking about other people. We're overconfident not only in our driving, we're overconfident that overconfidence shows up in all areas of our lives. So the unconscious bias has to do with making decisions about people. So we're thinking about unconscious bias. That's about the kind of information we have about people and the decisions we make around other people. And that is a problem when we're overconfident in our decision making. And so for those with more experience and authority, I'll give you an interesting study. There was a study done on doctors who were out of medical school for over a decade, couple of decades, senior doctors, very experienced, those with more authority, and just doctors who were recently coming out of medical school. They were given the same case to evaluate, which is a typical evaluation of how doctors do, of how good they are. And the senior doctors and the junior doctors got it right about the same rate. And why did they get it right about the same rate? Well, because the senior doctors had more experience and know-how, but the junior doctors had fresher information coming out of medical school. So senior doctors forgot some stuff and their information wasn't as fresh. But the senior doctors were much more confident about their answer and much less willing to change their mind, therefore, to run new tests and so on. So the danger with people with more experience and authority is less of a willingness to change your mind. So more overconfidence and less of a willingness to shift, less willingness to be humble. So it's very important to be humble, that what Andy was telling me, having that authentic closeness together with others. Part of that should be humility, being humble about yourself and your ability to make good decisions, and consulting with others and getting their feedback about the kind of decisions that you're making. So we have to understand, when we're talking about humility, all of this stuff, all of our decisions come from our emotions. Most of our decisions come from an emotional place. We vastly underestimate the role of emotions in our decision-making. Our decision-making defines about 90% of our decisions come from an emotional place. So that is where they come from. They come from a really emotional, intuitive place. When we just go ahead and make our decisions the way it feels like we should, when we do what comes to us naturally, without using the kind of evidence-based decision-making strategies that we're talking about here. So one of these decision-making strategies is to be more humble than we intuitively are, because we have the overconfidence bias, and that can cause us a lot of problems. Now, let's talk about decision-making and the framework. What's going on here? People are told when we're making decisions around other people, especially, so we're thinking about unconscious bias, right? That's about decision-making around other people, bad decision-making. They're told to go with their gut, trust their intuitions, follow their heart. So gurus like Tony Robbins tell us to be primal, be savage. And you have people like Malcolm Gladwell telling us to blink, make your decision in the blink of an eye. So trusting your intuition, that is something that feels very comfortable. So trusting our gut feels good and right to us. It's what is comfortable, but it often leads to pretty disastrous decisions because our gut intuitions, that primal savage state, is actually not wired for the modern world. Now think about the modern world. We are here connecting on Zoom in small video screens, right? We can't really connect to each other nearly as much as we do in person. Andy was telling me that there was an offsite recently, and that was very connecting, versus this, which is not nearly as connecting, right? That is something that you have to recognize, that our intuitions are not going to be well suited for the modern world of connecting virtually so much. It's because our gut evolved for the ancient savannah many, many thousands of years ago. That is what our intuitions are adapted for. That's where they're about. They're not adapted for the modern world. And that caused us to make some pretty bad decisions in the modern world. And they come from a combination of factors like our tribalism. We had to live in small tribes of 50 people to 150 people. That was very important in that savanna environment, that we were very tribal. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, well, then we would be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die. And if we weren't sufficiently hostile to other tribes, well, those tribes would take us over and we'd die as well. So we are built to be very tribal. Our intuitions are to be very tribal. And our intuitions are also to respond in a very quick fashion, fight or flight fashion, to various threats. They were life-saving for the hunter-gatherers, this fight or flight response and this tribalism. So the fight or flight response, right, that's about jumping. It was better to jump at 100 shadows in the savanna environment than to miss one saber-toothed tiger. The risks we faced were immediate, intense, in the moment. And that's not the kind of risks we face now. We face risks that are much more dangerous, but long-term, uncertain. They might come from a notification of your smartphone about some kind of fiscal crisis, inflation, or the other things that might be threatening. These are serious problems that we are not intuitively responding to them correctly. So that's a big danger for us, that our intuitions are leading us to make some pretty bad decisions. And the specific ways that our mind is miswired are cognitive biases. That's the specific term for the way that our mind is miswired. It comes from a combination of our evolutionary background and the structure of our brain. Our brains are inherently lazy, which is not to criticize them. They're wired to use the least energy possible, which is fine. That's the way that our brains are wired in the savanna environment with very low calories. And it was very important for us to use as little energy as possible. In the modern environment, that's not important to you. We have plenty of calories, but that's still the way our brains are wired. So we take a lot of shortcuts, like the overconfidence bias. So the overconfidence bias means that we jump to conclusions very quickly and stick to them very strongly. Think about that fight or flight response. When we were facing a situation that was life or death, we had to decide whether we want to jump at a shadow or not. Well, then it was very important for us to jump at a shadow, to jump at those shadows and just use a little bit of information to make a decision and stick to it. And that's what overconfidence is. Well, in the modern environment, that's a very bad idea, especially when you're thinking about other people. Using just a little bit of information to make an evaluation about them is not good, but that's what our intuition tells us to do. When you look at the research on how quickly we make judgments about other people, sometimes we make global judgments about those people within the first 5 to 10 seconds of meeting them. And that's obviously very bad, problematic, and wrong. That's where unconscious bias comes from, but that's just who we are as human beings. So unless we realize that and work against it, we're going to be making some pretty bad decisions. Now, think about, I'm going to run another poll, and I want to ask you, did you ever make a bad decision about someone, about another person, And looking back, you realize you had the information to make a better decision. So please go ahead and vote on it. Is that something that ever happened to you? Let's see, you've got 3/4 of the people participating. Good. All right. About 5 more seconds for those who haven't made their voice heard yet. And it's definitely something that happened to me. So, yeah, this is very, very natural for this to happen with people. All right. So we see that this happened to almost everyone. Just, over 90% of us had this happen to us. And the fact that you had all the information needed to make a good decision, and then you didn't make a good decision, that's coming from very likely a place of unconscious bias, where something steered you to make poor decisions about someone, even though you had the information that you needed to make a good decision. So that's the feeling. So think back to the feeling, how it felt when that happened, and realize that that's the feeling of falling into one of these cognitive biases. So that's how it feels. Now, let's talk about some more of these cognitive biases. And I'm going to answer a question that a number of you might have had when you heard me speak. Where are you from? So I told you my background is Ukrainian, but more specifically, people want to know where I'm from, specifically in that area of the world. And so my father is Ukrainian and my mother is Moldovan. And Moldova is a small country to the southwest of Ukraine. It's a small landlocked country. It's between Ukraine and Romania. So my dad moved from Ukraine to Moldova, where he met and married my mom, and I was born in Moldova, spent my summers in Ukraine, and I still have some family in Kiev. And that's something that's kind of worrisome for me right now. In the first month of the war with Russia, it was especially worrisome because Russia was close to surrounding Kiev and bombing it. But right now, I mean, they backed away, fortunately. The Ukrainian forces defeated them. But right now, there are some strikes going on in Kiev with the Russian missiles. I'm definitely a little bit worried about them, but not nearly as worried as I was in the first month of the war. So, but I grew up in Moldova, and then my parents left in 1991 to the United States. So I was born in 81, my parents left in 91, I was 10. We settled in New York City. And New York City is very much a cultural, very diverse. I know some of the team, one of the locations is New York, and that's where I grew up. That's home for me. And you, or New York, you know how diverse it is. You walk a block and you hear 12 different accents. So I didn't feel the need to drop my accent. Probably if I was where I am right now in Columbus, Ohio, I would have dropped my accent because to integrate here, or if I was in Tennessee, but not in New York City. So in New York City, I chose to keep my accent. My parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage. Unfortunately, I found out later when I moved to Chapel Hill to get my PhD, that's where I taught, as Andy mentioned. So I got my PhD there and I taught there. I found out that was kind of a dumb decision because of something called accent discrimination. So accent discrimination, it's a tendency to discriminate against those with accents that sound like you're not from around here, like you're foreign. This is a problem, and it's very prevalent, this accent discrimination, talking about one form of unconscious bias, right? It's a false perception of people being less trustworthy. It's a sense that you're not from my tribe. And remember that tribalism, it's one of the fundamental forces that causes bad decision-making around other people, which is what the essence of unconscious bias is. And here are 2 cognitive biases that you really want to be aware of. One is called the horns effect, kind of like someone having little horns. If you dislike one characteristic of someone because it's different than you, for example, their accent, their appearance, their ethnicity, their value system, their religious beliefs, whatever it might be, then you'll tend to dislike that person as a whole. You'll value them less. You'll feel they're less trustworthy, whether it's accent or anything like that. The same thing goes for if they have a characteristic that you like. It's like someone has a little halo on their head. It's called the halo effect. So if you like one characteristic of someone, then you'll have too positive view of their other characteristics, because it will feel like they're part of your tribe. So that's a really important dynamic to realize: the horns effect and the halo effect. The horns effect and the halo effect. I know the teams that are represented here collaborate well together, but I've seen teams in other companies with which I trained that had some dynamics between them that were quite problematic in terms of the horns effect and the halo effect, where they felt halo effect toward others from their own team. So halo effect toward others from their own team, but horns effect toward people from other teams, because they competed, they had some tensions about issues. So this is something that I've seen in other companies be a problem. But from what Andy told me, the teams here play well together, which is great. Now, you want to be thinking about how it's dangerous for business relationships. It can be dangerous for internal business relationships, but of course, external ones, whether it's the customer support team doing outward facing activities here, or in terms of evaluation, promotion, hiring. I'll show you an interesting example of that from a presentation I gave several years ago. So this is a presentation. So this will be a video of a presentation that I gave in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm based right now, when I was a professor at Ohio State. And so I was still a professor at Ohio State at that time. I left in 2018 just to do this consulting and training full time because my business was getting too big. So I run a consulting and training company now, 6-people company. But at that time, I was still a professor, and I was presenting to the local conference of the HR group. So the local HR group for Central Ohio, it's called HRACO. And this is a conference, an annual conference on diversity and inclusion. And if you know anything about Columbus, Ohio, you'll probably know that it's the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes, our college football team, where people are really, really proud of it and big fans in town. And our big rival up north is the University of Michigan Wolverines. So it's one of the biggest college football rivalries, if not the biggest. And so I'm asking these Central Ohioans whether they are going to hire a Michigan fan. And remember, Diversity Inclusion Conference, over 100 HR leaders who are coming voluntarily to a Diversity Inclusion Conference because they want to know about this topic. And this is the closing keynote. So, as you know, I'm a professor at Ohio State. I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. I'm guessing there are a lot of Buckeyes fans here, go Bucks, right? Oh, there you go. Now, how likely are you to hire a Michigan fan? See, 3 people. So that's 3 people out of over 100 who are going to hire a University of Michigan fan. Now, regardless of how we feel about Michigan fans and their poor choices in which team to root for, does that indicate anything about their performance as an employee? No, I know. Come on, that no should be stronger. So that's 3 people out of over 100 who are willing to hire a University of Michigan fan. And remember, these are HR leaders who are coming to a diversity inclusion conference, by their own will, coming to diversity. This is not like a required training. And I gave them a chance. 3 of them would hire University of Michigan fan, and I gave them a chance to change their mind, to go away from their initial intuitions and kind of think about it. And they wouldn't change their mind, as you could see. So when you're thinking about sports, obviously it doesn't matter what team you root for your ability to do the job. But such a seemingly minor dynamic can be so influential in shaping us, in causing this fundamental unconscious bias. Or, they're not conscious of it. They're not deliberately thinking, I'm going to hate on Michigan fans, but when asked about it, when probed, it comes up. So if somebody's in an interview and, they wouldn't get the interview, first of all, if it says the University of Michigan on their diploma, on their resume, right? So they wouldn't get in the door in the first place. Or if somehow by some luck they got in the door, if it was found out that they're a University of Michigan fan, well, they wouldn't proceed in the interview. Now, if you think about the small kind of element of someone's life that rooting for a certain team plays, how much do other things that are more important and salient cause unconscious bias? That is something to really be deeply introspective about, because we can make a lot of mistakes around other people in ways that we don't realize. Now, do you think this is something that might be useful to address in TikTok? So do you think that there might be some negative impacts within TikTok from the halo effect or the horns effect? Either of those, from the halo effect or the horns effect? Just over half. So let's give folks a little bit more time, still thinking about it. I'll give you 5 more seconds to make up your mind. Okay, so we see that over 90% of you believe that the halo effect or the horns effect are having a negative impact. So that's really important to know and understand that this is an issue, and this is something that you as leaders, of course, can take back to your teams and help people address and figure out as a problem. Good. Let's talk about another pair of cognitive biases, the optimism bias and the pessimism bias, the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Now, the optimism bias, these are kind of like it sounds. The optimism bias is about people who believe the glass is half full, who believe the grass is green on the other side of the hill. I tend to be, and by the way, this is not a binary. This is more, so it's not a binary, it's a range. It's not an either or, that you're either optimistic or pessimistic. And by the way, if you think you're realistic, that's a code word for pessimistic. So it's just a PC word for pessimistic, just to be clear. So if you call yourself a realist, you're a pessimist, you're just trying to be PC about it. Now, it's the optimism bias. I tend to be strongly optimistic. And people who are optimistic like me, we tend to be opportunity-oriented, entrepreneurial, creative, but we have some problems. We're too risk-blind. We see the world as being very full of opportunities, but don't see the threats that are in the world. Now, the pessimism bias is the opposite. It's people who see the glass as half empty, people who see the grass as yellow on the other side of the hill. And pessimists have a lot of strengths. They are great at managing threats, at stabilizing things, at improving things, but they tend to be too risk averse. So that is another tendency. So again, optimism bias and the pessimism bias. And you really need at least 2 of each on your team to help make good decisions. Because if you don't have 2 people, this is what happens. So if you don't have any other optimists, then you'll have a lot of trouble generating ideas. Optimists are great at generating ideas. I have 20 ideas before breakfast and it feels like they're all brilliant. That's what it feels like to be an optimist. I've learned to my bitter chagrin that they're not all brilliant, but that's what it feels like to be an optimist. But if I hired only other optimists in my company, 6-people company, we'd all have 20 ideas before breakfast. We go in 120 different directions because we'd be reinforcing each other's ideas, and then company would go bankrupt. That would not work out well. So I make sure to hire pessimists for my company. And you know what? It doesn't feel good for me to work with pessimists. I much prefer to work with other optimists. But what I do is I give my 20 quote unquote brilliant ideas to the pessimists, and they tell me that, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe these 3 are worth finishing baking. And they're going to improve these ideas and implement them, because that's really a big strength of pessimists, evaluating and improving and implementing ideas. So that's why you need at least 2 of each on your team. And you need to make sure that optimists and pessimists play well together, because a common tendency that I see going wrong is that optimists generate ideas in a team. Optimists generate ideas and pessimists just shoot them down. And then you have a lot of conflict and tensions and not very good products. What you really need to do is separate them. you need to separate the process of generating ideas, brainstorming. Pessimists are not very good at that. That's fine. You need to give that to the optimists, but then they need to give their ideas to the pessimists and just let them go and not hold on to their precious darlings, but give them to the pessimists, allow the pessimists to kill their darlings and evaluate which of the ideas are really worthwhile. Pessimists will see the flaws of each idea, and then they can fix the ones that are worthwhile to fix. So that's a much better way of collaborating between optimists and pessimists. And I bring up this example in terms of unconscious bias because it's an example of what's called neurodiversity. So when we're thinking about the typical unconscious bias, whether it's about ethnicity, religion, color, appearance, accent, these are things that we typically think about. But if we don't think about the way that we think differently, this neurodiversity aspect, and the optimism bias and the pessimism bias are only some of the aspects of neurodiversity that can cause people to make some bad evaluations of others. All right. Now, another cognitive bias I want to talk about is called the empathy gap. So the empathy gap. Now, we talked about how emotions determine our decisions. 90% of our decisions stem from our emotions, but we really underestimate how important emotions are for other people. We tend to treat other people as much more calm, cool, and rational than they are. So we tend to underestimate the extent of emotions, the way that emotions play a role in other people's decision-making. And it's especially the case that we underestimate other people's emotions when it feels like those people are not in our tribe, and especially if they're from an opposing tribe. So we tend to value the emotions of people in our tribe more, but we tend to underestimate the emotions of people in other tribes. And that's a bad problem because we are not going to be able to evaluate how they make decisions, and we're not going to be able to evaluate them effectively as people. We do too much of assuming that they're rational decision makers, and thus are not very good at predicting their decisions and their behaviors. So that's another really important cognitive bias that I want you to be aware of. Now, let's talk about overcoming these dangerous judgment errors. How do we overcome these errors? The empathy gap, optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, Horn's effect, overconfidence bias. You need to learn to go against your intuitions. I saw some people mentioning the book Thinking Fast and Slow. That's a great book. It goes in depth into these cognitive biases. My expertise is in another area that Danny Kahneman doesn't cover. So he focuses on what are the cognitive biases themselves. I focus on how to address them. So I'm kind of the second generation of scholars who works on actually defeating these problems, not identifying them, which is what Daniel Kahneman's generation did. And that's for what he won the Nobel Prize. So you need to learn to go against your intuitions. Our intuitions, as we talked about, were great for helping human beings survive in that ancient savanna environment, but that's not good for the modern world. I'll give you an example of where you probably learned some ways of going against your intuitions. Think about what you eat. In the savanna environment, when we came across a source of sugar, honey, bananas, apples, it was very important for us to eat as much of it as possible. If we didn't eat as much of it as possible, we weren't going to be the ones who would survive and thrive and reproduce. So we're the descendants of those who had a very strong fight or flight response, had a very strong tribal response, and were very strongly triggered by sugar. Great in the savanna environment, not good in today's environment of lots of processed food. So if some grateful vendor sends a box of donuts to the TikTok office, right? They are going to be there. It's going to be a box of 12 donuts, and you're passing by those donuts. It's very tempting to take half a donut, and then you don't want to leave half a donut for somebody else, and then you get triggered by sugar once you take that other half, and then you take another donut and a third donut. Not that it ever happened to me, right? So this is a problematic tendency. This is something that happens to us, and this is intuitive. There's a reason there's an obesity epidemic here in this country with all the cheap calories that we have here and all the very fattening processed foods we have here. Hopefully, you figured out a way to address that. Maybe you pass by those donuts and you go for a bowl of fruit that another grateful vendor sent over, which aren't nearly as triggering. So that is a much healthier snack. And so you've probably worked already on your physical fitness. but how much are you working on your mental fitness? So your mental fitness is, you make your money, you live your life by your brain, right? You don't live it by your physical fitness. How much do you work out with your brain, your mental fitness? How much do you pay attention to that? How much do you pay attention to addressing these unconscious biases which cause us to make so many bad decisions? Our brain is our most important investment, but we don't exercise it nearly as much. We don't pay nearly as much attention to improving it as we do our diet or physical exercise, going to the gym or whatever we're doing. Mental fitness is much, much more important in many ways than our diet or exercise. But how much time and effort do we spend on it? We need to spend much more time and effort on our mental fitness. And the first step to that is learning about these cognitive biases and how to address them effectively. Because learning about each cognitive bias helps you address that one bias, but you also need to understand the kind of intuitions that drive us to make bad decisions. Once you learn about some of these cognitive biases, it becomes more natural to spot these problems. I'll also give you a technique that you can use to address a number of cognitive biases at once. It's going to be 5 questions that you can use to avoid decision disasters. So it's a very useful technique that you can use to address a number of cognitive biases at once. When you're making a decision about another person, or more broadly, making a decision that you don't want to screw up. But here we're focusing about unconscious bias, so decision-making around other people. Let's talk about these 5 questions in turn. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? What evidence didn't you take into account about this person? Maybe you're thinking about collaborating with someone. Maybe you're thinking about making a new hire. Maybe if you're a customer support team, maybe you're helping one of your customers with some serious issues. What important information didn't you get fully consider about the situation? Try to look at the information that goes against your intuitions, that goes against what you're predisposed to do. Try to prove yourself wrong, because what we typically do is try to prove ourselves right. And that's not great, because we just give ourselves the same information. There's a cognitive bias called the confirmation bias, which causes us to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So that's a big problem. So you want to make sure to try to prove yourself wrong. That's a very healthy tendency. Second, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet fully address? So we talked about a number of judgment errors here: the overconfidence bias, the empathy gap, optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, Horn's effect. You'll get a book at the end of the presentation, if you want to, which will go in more depth into each of these cognitive biases and how they relate to decision-making and how to overcome them. So once you learn more about these cognitive biases, you'll be able to bring them to mind very quickly. So if you're making a decision about another person, the halo effect, the Horn's effect, the empathy gap might all be playing a role. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about a mentor you have at TikTok. Think about someone who you trust. So someone who serves as a good source of information and evaluation about other people when you're making a decision about other people. What would they suggest you do in this situation? And having that external perspective can be really helpful. So the first 3 questions are about making the decision. Now we're transitioning into implementing it. How have you addressed all the ways this can fail? So let's say you're writing an important email and you want to run it through these 5 questions. And the 5 questions, they only take a couple of minutes to do if you are making the right choice. And if you're making the wrong choice, you definitely want to make sure to take the time to go through them more thoroughly. So the 4th one, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? Let's say you're writing an email to a colleague who you want to persuade them to do something. What about reading it as though, imagine your colleague gets it and they're in a negative state of mind. Maybe they're anxious or frustrated or annoyed, or maybe, they're flying to Poland and their plane has been really delayed. So whatever happens, think about that negative state and think about how they would read it. And then maybe you want to revise the email to make sure that it addresses that person's emotions more effectively. So you address the empathy gap. Finally, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? So what would cause you to change your mind about the situation, about whatever decision you're making? What new information would cause you to change your beliefs? Now, this is something that's very important and it's underestimated, because when we make a decision, we tend to stick to it much harder than we should. So our intuitions cause us to stick to decisions, and but it really helps to ask, well, what would cause me to change my mind about the decision? So let's say with an email, you can say, well, if I haven't heard from my colleague in 3 days, then I'll send them, I'll call them on the phone or something like that. And then you don't have to wait and wonder why your colleagues are not why your colleagues aren't responding. So this is a much, much better approach to making decisions. All right. Now I'm going to do another poll. Do you think it would be valuable for you and your team to use the 5 questions technique to make good enough decisions about other people? So please go ahead and vote. Good, I see most of you participated. Let's give it 5 more seconds. Okay, so 100%, excellent. And then you'll get a copy of the decision aid and you can use that to help yourself make good decisions, and you can spread it throughout TikTok. It's going to be very useful. Excellent, good. So 3 additional resources, I mentioned that I'll provide those. I'll be happy to give coaching to the first 3 claimants who want coaching, articles, podcasts, and videos. I'll share those as well. The decision aid for the 5 questions, and my copy of my best-selling book. So this is the book about decision-making around other people. It's called The Blind Spots Between Us: How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. And I'll run a poll to see who wants that. And then Andy will provide me with the emails of the people who want the book and coaching and so on. And I'll send you the information. Okay, I'll be happy to take any questions now. You can use chat, you can unmute yourself, whatever is convenient for you. Use the Q&A function. Oh, we don't have Q&A. Anyway, chat or unmute yourself. Let's. Oh, you're welcome, Kevin. I'm glad it's helpful. So TJ asks, do you have any advice if you happen to find yourself on the other end of unconscious biases? So this is a tough question. You want to focus on empathy here, and you want to understand where the person is coming from. And you want to see if you can help that person understand what you're feeling. Now, you can kind of talk about the way that some people might be responding negatively. Let's say if someone has an accent. And a thing that happens to me is that people sometimes ask me, I mean, where are you from is a generally nice way to say it. But if somebody says, hey, you ain't from around here, are you? That's kind of a negative way to say the same thing. And that's going to be a signal that someone has an unconscious bias toward me, negative predisposition, because of my accent, because of my background. Now, a way to address that is to connect with this person, empathize with them, and get them into a real conversation about myself and my background, about where I come from. So for them to understand my story and my background, that will help them empathize with me. And if you're finding yourself on the end or target end of unconscious bias, you want to humanize yourself to the other person. You want to share your story, especially as it relates to whatever the bias might be. So again, if the bias for me has to do with my accent, then I would share about my family's coming to the United States and kind of the background that I shared with you earlier. And whatever it might be for you, you would want to do the same thing. So that way you create a sense of empathy and a sense that, hey, you're a real human being, whatever the bias might be. So Andre asks, what do you think are some effective and polite ways to point out any blind spots that other people may have? So that's a really important question. And you can, a way to speak about that is to frontline your status. So you could say something like, as someone who grew up in another country, here's what I can share about my experience. So you position yourself as being an expert, and through that way, through that phrasing, and you frame the conversation as being, you know something that they don't, because you have a certain experience that they don't. So having that framing helps people realize that coming from another country is not simply, a negative, it's a positive in many ways. And especially, let's say, if you're on the customer support team, right, user support team, then you're going to be able to relate better to people who are not from the United States, and that will be a benefit. So there are many places where you can have, it can be beneficial to come from a non-American context. You're welcome, Andrea. Other folks. Give you 5 more seconds, and then I'll turn it over to Andy. You can unmute yourself, and happy to answer questions.
Well, Dr. Gleb, I did just want to say thank you again for taking the time out of your day to give this lesson to all of us. I'm really excited to continue learning from you and learning from your thought leadership in this space, and also the hybrid environments as well. I'm looking forward to, like I mentioned, reading more about that this weekend. As a reminder, everyone on the Global User Ops team, thank you again for taking time out of your Thursday to spend time together. I think as we continue to learn on such important topics like this together, it makes us stronger as a unit and brings us closer into making sure that we're supporting our teams and supporting each other. I know after this as well, we'll send out a feedback survey. I would love to get your feedback, and Dr. Gleb, I'll also share with you as well as far as feedback goes too. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to talking with everyone very soon.
You're very welcome. And thank you everyone for your nice comments there too. That's wonderful. I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you again, Dr. Gleb. I appreciate you.